Welcome back to the second video lecture this week. This is just a brief overview of the letter of James with some of the big questions that most all commentators have to deal with. So this general overview will be a real historical analysis of sorts. Common historical questions in all exegesis courses has to do with when was this letter or book written, the date of the letter. The other one is authorship. Who wrote the letter, and how can we know that they wrote it? What's the genre of the writing? Is it a gospel? Is it a letter? Is it an apocalyptic literature? Those kind of questions. And then how is the text itself structured? From chapter to chapter, or is there a structure that is recognizable of sorts? Who are the recipients of the letter? Is it written to an individual? Is it written to a single congregation? Is it sent to congregations in a region of the Roman Empire? Or is it sent to all believers everywhere? The recipients are a major issue. From where was the letter written? Those are the kind of historical questions that generally get asked in exegesis courses. And then what is the literary relationship between this writing and other writings, whether they're in the New Testament, Old Testament, apocryphal literature, etc. Those are all general historical questions that are a part of an exegesis class, and they're very important. James is no different than any other letter in the New Testament in that regard. But these questions are really, for me, for a history nerd, they're very important and really interesting. And I think there's some things that are particular to James that make it even more interesting, mainly because of how the relationship between James and Paul has been posited throughout the Christian tradition. And does the letter of James show any evidence of engaging with Paul as a human being or with Paul's writings? And those kind of things. And I think it's clear that there is some engagement there. The letter of James never mentions Paul whatsoever. But chapter 2, 14 through 26 talks about faith and works in a way that's very reminiscent of Paul, if not predates Paul. Paul might be reacting to James. In Acts, you got chapter 15 and chapter 21 that narrates a story where Paul comes to Jerusalem and engages in dialogue with James and other leaders of the church there in Jerusalem. So according to Acts, there's certainly some kind of engagement between James and Paul. And then Paul himself writes in his letter to the Galatians about his own interaction with James. And in that letter, he says that he comes... in chapter 2, I think he says he comes twice to Jerusalem, maybe 3 times. 3 years after he became a Christian, became a follower of Jesus, he came to Jerusalem and spoke with James. Then he came back again, and it said he laid his gospel in front of them, so that he would make sure he wasn't running in vain. He calls them so-called pillars. So Paul certainly says he has an encounter with James. The writer of the Acts of the Apostles says that James and Paul encountered each other. The question is there evidence? Is there enough evidence in the letter of James to say that this letter was written after James and Paul encountered each other, or not? It's a big question in the letter of James. Everybody who writes about James has to address this issue. You'll see how I address it. You'll see how Luke Timothy Johnson addresses it, and I hope you can tell the difference between the way we deal with it. The other question mark is about who's the identity of this James, and how do we know that in historical terms. James is a fairly common name, even in the Greco-Roman world, certainly within Jewish circles. Who is the James that this name refers to? did that James actually write it, or did somebody write it later in his name? This is very common in the New Testament, in fact. Most all scholars of the New Testament don't believe that Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Everybody believes, almost everybody believes, that a disciple of Paul or disciples of Paul wrote those letters in his name, which was common practice in this time period. So it's not that big of a deal. It's more of a big deal for us when we think about plagiarism than anything else. So is that the same thing that's happening to the letter of James? Another really important aspect of the letter of James is how does James engage the Roman Empire? Or does James engage the Roman Empire? You'll certainly see in the readings how scholars deal with that kind of question. But how is James negotiating empire in this letter? What's James' relationship to Roman imperialism? How does this look in the setting of James from his place of origin? James, if it's attributed to the James who's the leader of the church in Jerusalem, then you certainly have a Jerusalem context. And how does James in a Jerusalem context relate to other Jewish leaders at the temple? And how do we know what that relationship looks like? In that kind of complex network of relationships within Jerusalem among different forms and schools of Judaism, how does James uniquely negotiate that identity over against Roman imperialism? Those are some of the things we're going to address in the next couple of lectures, but just pay real close attention to that. That stuff's not self-evident, and we as scholars have to do the reading and do the work to make those statements so that they're based on something. We can't just say, of course, James wrote it just because his name's on it. There's a lot more that goes into it than that. So I just want to give you a general idea of some of the kind of questions, historical questions, that we ask when we approach New Testament letters in the process of exegesis. So it's not just what does the text say, it's what can we know about the text? How can we understand the environment that produced the text, the environment that received the text, how the text got from one place to the other in the Greco-Roman world. These are some of the questions that some of the historical questions we'll ask along the way. If you have any questions about this, in the next couple of lectures, we'll deal specifically about date, authorship, genre, structure, recipients, place of origin, literary relationships. So we won't have to do that now. I just want you to know that the kind of questions that are asked in exegesis courses, they're generally like this. We're going to ask some other questions in some of other lectures as we get into it. Because history isn't self-evident. We write history, and the way we write it depends on who we are as a human being and how we understand things. So that's where a lot of the modern strategies of reading engages with human identity, because we don't believe there's such thing as objective history or objective truth or objective fact. We are always subjects. We are always interpreting this and delivering our interpretations to an audience. And we're always in that process. So how does my subjectivity change the way I understand things? How does that subjectivity shape meaning as I engage text? Those are critical questions while we ask historical questions. Those other overriding questions will be determinative in the way we understand literature. I can't get outside of my own identity to read a text. And that's kind of the historical fallacy of the historical critical method. And generally what's happened in biblical studies in particular, but history in general, is that the winners write history. And the history of biblical studies for the past 150 years is the fact that it's been written primarily by white heterosexual men, Protestant or Catholic. And that has been masked by objectivity. People with those identities have said, well, we're not bringing ourselves to the text. We're just reading objectively. And what gets put down as truth and history and objective truth and objective history and objective facts is still very kind of ingrained in the identities that produced it. So just recently, and I mean recently as in the past couple of decades, scholars have become very honest about how their identity shapes the way they understand texts, so that people can't claim some kind of objectivity and getting outside of yourself. What that does has normalized patriarchal readings and white readings and Protestant or Catholic readings. So we've objectified all those identities rather than the text itself. So we'll pay real close attention to that as we read and ask these historical questions, knowing that we always bring our identity to the text. If you have any questions, feel free to give me an email.